All right. Hello again, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rana Ahmed, and I recently took over as chair of the Langara Research Ethics Board from John Russell, who served as chair since the board's inception. And our workshop this year is based on the use of artificial intelligence in research, and in particular, its effect on privacy. Our guest speaker is Dr. Holly Longstaff, who currently serves as the Director of Privacy and Access at the Provincial Health Services Authority. Holly and I were in fact PhD students while we both worked at UBC's Center of Applied Ethics. And of course, it was no surprise for any of us who worked with her that she has gone on to great success in her field. Dr. Longstaff is a PhD trained ethicist and research consultant. She serves as the ethicist on the BC Cancer Research Ethics Board and a US-based institutional research board. She has worked as a consultant for Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and the CIHR Ethics Office. Her work has been published in a variety of journals, including CMAJ, Trends in Neuroscience, and Cell Stem Cell. Holly is responsible for guiding the development and implementation of innovative approaches to privacy policy and practice. She advises on the privacy requirements relating to new provincial initiatives, and she also provides leadership in developing and implementing governance mechanisms to enable multidisciplinary review of privacy and security requirements for new initiatives and research, including province-wide platforms and systems, digital and information technologies, and data access and sharing. So it is with great pleasure that I now turn things over to Dr. Holly Longstaff.
Thank you, Rana. For anybody that may not be aware, the Provincial Services Authority is this big provincial health authority that covers all sorts of different programs. So BC Cancer is part of us, Emergency Health Services, Children's Hospital, Women's Hospital, all these big provincial bodies, cardiac services. And my job, I'm a service provider. I'm an ethics and privacy service provider. So I serve the researchers across all of those different programs. So that's what I do in my day-to-day work. And I'm just going to share my screen with you because I have some slides. There, can you see them, Rana?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. I am going to be talking about artificial intelligence and research based on some of the work that I'm doing with my researchers. And I really do want to encourage us to blow up everything that we think about ethics and privacy when it comes to something like artificial intelligence. But before I get there, I do want to talk about some really kind of probably will be boring information about privacy in British Columbia, because it's really important to set that stage and clarify a lot of these myths before we can get to the discussion of artificial intelligence, because you won't see otherwise how it's different and poses some challenges and interesting opportunities for us. And we have a kind of a big group here, but I would love it if I could know just a little bit more about you. You don't have to turn your video on or anything like that, but I just love to know, if you could say your name and what you do, just so I can kind of get a sense of who's in the room, and I can call your name, and then maybe if you could just let us know. So we already heard from Rana, you heard from me. I'll go to Doug because he's next to me. Could you say a little bit about what brings you here today? Doug?
Yeah, I'm unmuting, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Doug Caldwell. I'm a community member. I've been invited to be a community member on this board. I'm a retired child protection worker. I mean, many 35 years in the field. Finished as a complaint specialist working for a provincial office, and I've had lots of experience with issues of privacy but just with working with people in general, and so that's why I'm here. I'm just an interested community member.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you for joining us. And Ryan, could you go next briefly?
Holly, I teach in the Department of Kinesiology at Langara, and I teach biomechanics and motor control, and I'm a member of the REB here.
Oh, I used to work with a lot of guys that did that research over at Simon Fraser University when I was there, and they're like freezing people and making them run on treadmills and doing all sorts of really cool stuff. Yeah.
That's us.
Yeah. And Pia.
Hi, I'm the Clinical Research Ethics Board Manager at UBC.
Great. And Joanne?
Hi, everybody. I'm Joanne Rajat. I'm the Manager of Records Management and Privacy here at Langara. So I'm the privacy officer, and I'm the newly appointed LREB liaison, taking over from Patricia Sia, who's retiring shortly. So I think that officially starts May 3rd.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And Pooja, if you want to go next, you're next on my.
Hi, I'm Pooja. I am an instructor in the early childhood department, and I'm just here to learn more about ethics and privacy and yeah, everything else.
Great, perfect. And Ruby.
Yes, hi, I'm from Langara, Mandarin Program Coordinator for Mandarin Program. So I'm always interested to find out, with the privacy, when it's come to, when there's two different language involved, what is something that I need to be aware of? So that brought me here. So I'm looking forward for the, all the stuff we're gonna learn.
Oh, what an interesting intersection to work in. Oh. And Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine Brown. I'm a member of the philosophy department at Langara and also a member of the REB board.
Okay, I have something interesting to say about philosophy when it comes to artificial intelligence. I was at a meeting with the big artificial intelligence companies and a bunch of our really prominent clinicians. We were all talking, and they were talking about the fact that this algorithm is a learning algorithm, and one of our clinicians said, I think we should have a philosopher here. I was like, yeah, you do. You need philosophers at the table for these discussions. So I see Pete Poon, so I'm not sure who that is.
Hi, Holly. My name is Penny Poon. I work in the Office of Academic Quality Assurance at Langara. I have a background and work experience in research and data analytics, and which is why I'm very interested in your topic today.
Okay. And Serenia Town.
Yes, I am the instructional staff for the Department of Educational Technology and also the Library Information Technology. So because I feel the technology is going much faster than what we have implemented policy. So I would like to take, get in perspective.
I agree with you. Sarah?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Flan. I'm a clinical research ethics board coordinator at UBC, and I have a specific interest in machine learning from my master's work.
And Katrina?
Hi, I'm Katrina. I work for the project management office for Workday at Langara, and I'm also going back to school for nursing. So interested in that perspective.
Yeah. And Serene, if that's how I say that, your name, Serene?
That's correct. I'm Serene Malaj, and I'm from the computer science department. And I'm doing some research at BCIT on AI applications to HVAC systems for saving energy on buildings. So the subject is really interesting.
Okay. And I see Fredatom, Fred Adam. Fred? I don't know who that is. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Dare?
Does my mic work?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, hi, my name's Diar. I am a psychology instructor and researcher at Langara, and I'm an LREB board member. So I'm here today, just got the notice, I guess, through our committee.
And okay, and Susan?
Hi, sorry. I'm Susan Sverdrup Phillips, an instructor in sociology and also an LREB member.
And Albert?
I'm an instructor from the math and stat department, and I'm actually doing a couple of granted research in AI, and I'm also involved in one of the research project that was recently approved by the Research Ethics Board.
Okay, okay.
I'm looking at both sides.
Yeah. And Gordon?
I'm Gordon Rowe, anthropology instructor at Langara, and most of my research experience is ethnographic face-to-face very qualitative. So I'm curious about other methodologies.
Okay, and Elmira.
UBC Clinical Research Ethics Board, I'm staff.
And I think last but not least, we have Paulo.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I'm from the chemistry department. I've been an RAB member for a while, but last year was a little slow, simply because of time conflicts. Let's see how it changes this year. And good to see everyone here to get to know you guys.
Great. Did I miss anyone? I don't think so.
No, I think that was everybody.
Okay, perfect. So I am going to try to demystify research privacy for you. By the end of my first set of slides, I want you to know that you are all going to be experts in research privacy. That this is all you need to know to be able to do my job at the PHSA. So I want to demystify research privacy, and then we'll go on to artificial intelligence. Here's the thing. We have this privacy law in British Columbia called the BC Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Some people call it FIPA, some people call it FOIPA, just to be extra confusing. FIPA, FOIPA, it's the same thing. It covers public bodies, so academic institutions, health authorities, we're all covered by the FIPA. Private industry is something different. There is a ton of mythology around here. I'm part of a national privacy group that supports a national data platform, and we did a legislative review with the help of lawyers, of course, across Canada to look at the different privacy legislations. And I'm telling you, we have one of the most nimble, flexible privacy legislations that you could ask for when it comes to research. Very, very flexible and nimble. And so I'm going to actually show it to you. But there's been a ton of mythology around it because there's too many non-lawyers reading it, first of all. So like for me at my job, I do not interpret the FIPA. I'm an ethics person. I go to our legal department, they interpret it for me, and then I go forward with that. So when it's good to think about it kind of like a skeleton of permissibility, and you pick a section and you follow it. What's happened in the past is that you get some kind of weird advice from people that say, you know, you can't share data unless it's de-identified and consented and it has to stay in Canada. Those are all different sections of FIPA. You don't smush them all together and try to follow them all at once. You pick a section and you follow it. So there's so many different ways that you can be compliant with the FIPA. One is through Section 35, which I will show you, which we do almost all of our research and statistical work under. And that's and FIPA really applies to personal information, identifiable information, not something that has been totally de-identified. So it applies to like the most identifiable information. You can be compliant with it through Section 35, like I said, which I'll show you. You can do it with consent, or you can do it through notices. So when you come into a health authority, you will see these notices everywhere. They talk about, you know, that we're going to be using your data for health research where permitted under law, with or without consent. We're going to be using your data in electronic health records and systems and stuff in order to be able to function, keep lights on and things like that. This is one way that you can be compliant with the FIPA, is just have notices around letting people know what it means to, when you walk into a hospital, wherever, that we're going to be doing certain things with your data. Or you can use Section 35. Section 35 is when you want to share big pots of data, like maybe, you know, one of my researchers at the CDC, because the CDC is part of the PHSA, so we've been very busy this year. But maybe they want to share a bunch of data with their colleagues in Arizona. We would follow Section 35. And this is all it is. This is all it is. It's very, very sensible. So the public body can disclose personal information in its custody or control for a research purpose if the research purpose cannot be accomplished without that identifiable information, that you're not using it to directly contact people, because we have a different part of FIPA that we depend on for that any linking is not harmful for them, and that the public body feels comfortable that the security has been taken care of, that the identifiers will be removed when appropriate, and that kind of stuff. When you look at Section 35, you will see that the REB takes care of the first bits. So is it necessary? Is it going to hurt anybody? Linking and all that kind of stuff. The rest of it is done through an agreement, through an agreements office. So that's UILO at UBC. You probably have an agreements office at Langara. There's an agreements office at our health authority. They write the agreement to make sure that everybody agrees on where the data are going to be stored and stuff. That's all there is to it. And FIPPA Section 35 can be followed with or without consent, inside or outside Canada. So it's very, very permissible, very, very nimble. And you can see that it takes all the important things into consideration. And it's very consistent with those of us that sit on REBs with the waivers of consent and the waiver of data articles that are in the Tri-Council policy statement. So if people want to share big amounts of data or little amounts of data, but they don't want to get consent for a variety of reasons, you review it according to these articles. And they're, when you read them through against Section 35, they dovetail. So our legislation in British Columbia dovetails with what we have to follow in an ethics guidance at the national level. So we're very lucky, and that's for tissue. Now, if you don't want to follow Section 35, you can be compliant with it by getting consent from people. This does not apply in the research context very much because our consent forms kind of go well above and beyond what is required, but then they don't mention the specific section of FIPPA that they're following. So this is more for non-research activities, quality improvement, evaluation. And I have a template on my website that's about this long. And when my researchers fill it out, if they're doing a quality improvement project, they fill it out and it forces them to be FIPPA compliant, and then they go on their way and do their quality improvement surveys. So to be compliant with the FIPPA, you just need to say what you're doing, what legal authority you have to do it. So you have to refer to the specific section of FIPPA and the title and the contact information for someone to ask questions to. That's it. That's consent under FIPPA. There's a lot of confusion, and this really is important when you're dealing with artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is often done on these big platforms, often uses cloud-based technology. If you are going to do it with consent, there's all this confusion around, oh, well, what about wet signatures? And, you know, how are we going to get people to sign a consent form and all that? Look, there's an Electronic Transactions Act in Canada, and it is not controversial. I don't care what lawyer you talk to, it is not controversial to get e-signatures. It is what the lawyers describe it to me is that it is about the meeting of the minds. You need to demonstrate the meeting of the minds. You can do that with a wet signature. You can do that by clicking a button saying I consent. You can do that by doing an e-signature. It doesn't matter. It is what you're trying to demonstrate is the meeting of the minds. And there's this idea that a wet signature does more legal work or privacy work than a clicking of a button. It doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. It doesn't lower your risk. It doesn't do any more work for you. Or this idea that, you know, if we do more paperwork, that somehow we're more protected. We're not. All you're doing is wasting valuable resources. So we need to get rid of all these kind of like all this extra paperwork, all this bureaucracy, and start using the nimbleness that we have within the Canadian environment. I have this little blurb on my website called Desperately Seeking Signatures, and it's just to my researchers there and others. We spend so much time worrying, you know, oh, is this the right person in this other organization signing this agreement on you know, and then you spend all this time trying to find the right person, and you should do some due diligence. But if that person at the other organization presents themselves as the person that is the right person to sign things, then that binds that organization to it. So there's a lot of, we can relieve ourselves of a lot of the duties that we think that we have when it comes to signatures and all that. So that I'd just like to provide that for some clarity, because it really is important when you start dealing with electronic platforms. We also can cold contact our patients within the health authorities. And if somebody outside the health authority, like you at Langara, wanted to come to PHSA and cold contact our patients for research purposes, we would bring you into our family through a service contractor agreement. But the reason our own people can do cold contact is because of this thing called Section 33.1. And we're able to disclose personal information, which includes contact information, to our researchers to cold contact their patients without anything else. Because we believe it's part of their duty and their jobs, the duties that they are required to do their job within the health authority. So if you're within a health authority, you can cold contact. If you're outside, we can bring you in and you can do it. Or you can go to consent to these registries where people have already agreed to be contacted for future research purposes. We also have lots of wonderful agreements within the PHSA, within BC, that take care of a lot of legal and privacy work. One is the General Health Information Sharing Agreement. All the health authorities in the Ministry of Health have agreed to share data. It's a massive effort that was led by Stephen Tam over at the BCH. And the ISP underneath these big agreements just indicates where data is going. So that's the railroad tracks there. So the agreement is the important thing. The information sharing plan says where data are going to go from one place to the other. The Ministry of Health, I won't read this to you, but just for your information, if you are interested, has produced some documents to try to clarify some of these issues around what do we mean by de-identified, all this stuff. It was produced in 2018. It dovetails completely with the Tri-Council policy statement. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of BC also produced an incredible myth-busting report that tried to provide a lot of clarity about privacy in British Columbia. I think it's fabulous. It didn't help, unfortunately. I don't know why. It's absolutely wonderful, but it's there. And I will share these slides with you for you after in case you want to use any of these resources or read through them. But here's where we get to artificial intelligence. So as you saw in Section 35, we've always had the ability to do many things under Section 35 for research. Artificial intelligence, never been a problem. Cloud-based technology, never been a problem. But the problem really is not that we can't do it in research, it's that research is small. So in the FIPA, although we had all this flexibility under Section 35, which pertains to research, outside research, they were really constrained. They did not have the same flexibility that we did. So in 2019, before the pandemic craziness, the ministry changed the FIPA to permit Canadian cloud services so that you can use them, whether that's for outside of the research context. And so why does that matter when we're dealing with research? It matters because all of a sudden the entire health authority, including all the clinical folks and everything like that, could all start negotiating with Amazon, with these big players to do cloud-based services, instead of my poor researchers spending a ton of money trying to do their little project and use the cloud analytics and stuff like this. Now we have the negotiating power of the whole health authority, the whole province. So this was super transformative and really exciting. But then the pandemic hit and we didn't have the chance to really take advantage of this change to FIPA in time. So they changed the FIPA again in an emergency change of it that said store data anywhere. It's temporary, it's just for the pandemic. And they did that because they needed to set up virtual learning for kids at school like overnight. So that's why that was done. That will stop, but will always be allowed to use now because of this first change, Canadian cloud services, which will give a tremendous amount of flexibility and analytic power to the health authorities and the BC environment in total. So just for your information, now that I've said everything is permissible and nimble and all these kinds of, we do have some weird things in BC that make things a little tricky. One of them is the eHealth Act. The eHealth Act, you would assume that if you get consent from participants to use their data, that you could use it. Not true. There are some data that are considered special in BC. PharmaNet is one of them. There's some others listed here. If you want to access those data, even with consent, you have to go through the BC Data Stewardship Committee. So this is an extra thing that you have to do in BC for these particular kind of data that are considered special. If I was playing a guessing game with you, I would probably think this is going to go away at some point. It doesn't work very well anymore when we're doing all of these huge data initiatives, but it is the case in BC. It makes sharing these data a little tricky. So I hope that what I've conveyed, I'm done with the FIPA talk, that rule following behavior in BC under the FIPA is not all that helpful. You can see, looking at Section 35 and the consent requirements and all these other things, with the exception of maybe the Data Stewardship Committee, but even that has a process. Just trying to look to Section 35 to get guidance, or even the Tri-Council policies, statement doesn't speak to things like artificial intelligence. It doesn't help you all that much. Rule following does not help you. So much of what we do really is not about the FIPA, is not about TCPS and BC. It's about our interpretation, our own sense of risk tolerance and stuff like that. And that's where we can lead into some pretty sticky areas. So it is important to note that in British Columbia, we had some pretty spectacular failures during the pandemic. Shocking things that we were not able to do when it comes to multi-site studies. So you can imagine under the FIPA, every legal entity in BC, different health authorities, universities, They're all separate legal entities and they all interpret FIPPA differently. That's their legal right to do that. That's not a great thing when it comes to data sharing. What does it mean to comply with Section 35? What do you like when you see an agreement? So it's very, very, very difficult to share data in BC, and it's really, really hard to set up multi-site studies. We've had our own researchers here in BC that have been unable to set up their own research here, and they've been forced to go do research elsewhere. There's been stuff about this in the news. That is how it is right now. Hopefully, people in powerful positions have observed this and maybe we'll make some changes, but we were unable to collect, set up a biobank in time for the first wave, for example. That's a missed opportunity forever. There's other things, and it's no one group's fault. Everyone is doing their job. Everyone's doing what they are required to do under the FIPPA, but because we are all separate legal entities, we can't just delegate to other bodies, and it just makes these things, it's the system that is the problem. It's not any one person or an organization. But what it leads to is a lot of broken promises to our participants. If you take whole genome sequence research, for example, people are giving us their most very precious data that they could give, their whole genome sequence, and we know that data just in some cases just sits around. It does not get shared the way it was intended, doesn't get researched on the way it was intended, because we can't agree about what should be in a consent form, because we all have a different interpretation, all these kinds of things. And if you are going to go with consent, consent is clean. So if you have written the consent in a funny way or a strange way, a way that other RABs don't agree with, we're bound by that. If you use Section 35 without consent, then you make sure that sharing is done and it's safe and all those kinds of things. But if you write a consent form, I've seen consent forms that have all sorts of options at the end, like you can use it for this kind of research, but not that kind of research. You can share it for this, you can share it for that. Actually operationalizing that is impossible. So what happens when you have these consent forms where people have agreed to all sorts of things and this and not that and whatever, what happens to those when they get to the data people is they get thrown in the garbage. So that is a broken promise to that participant, because you cannot operationalize this unless you had millions and millions of dollars for every possible use. There is no way to track all that kind of stuff. So there are some big, big efforts at the national level, spending millions of dollars trying to get pots of data and initiatives happening at the national level so that we can kind of circumvent all of these problems at the provincial level. And I'll talk about those in a bit. But really what we have to do, and we all know this in ethics, is get back to basics. The FIPPA does not help us. The FIPPA gives us a really clever, nimble framework to know where we have to work within, but it's not going to help us do our work and help us guide our practice. So, in my work, just like I'm sure all of you, I go back to my ethics principles, and of course, there's different ethics principles that we use. These are not the ethics principles of the Tri-Council policy statement. That's okay. These are the ones I was trained on. So autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. They conflict with each other to foster good ethical decision-making, right? We want to make all things considered judgments, all relevant things in consideration. This conceptual framework from bioethics I use all the time in my work. The difference between substantive ethics and procedural ethics. So substantive ethics are doing things properly, substantive ethics are the moral values that guide you through your work. And the procedural ethics are doing things properly, like the properly constructed consent form. And you need to pay attention to kind of both of those things to achieve just outcomes, right? And it's important when we're thinking about artificial intelligence and these big new novel initiatives is what do we throw around a lot of these words like benefit and risk and harm and all these kinds of things. What do we really mean? We need to be, that's why I love working with philosophers and engineers and lawyers, because they're very precise with language. And I've tried to embrace that in my own practice. What do I mean when I say risk? I don't care about, in my job, I don't really care about risks. I care about risks of harm. So if you were to re-identify a bunch of data and find out that I took a bunch of ethics courses, a few years ago with Rana at the Center for Applied Ethics, like who cares? I would hope that I've taken a lot of ethics courses and that Rana's taken ethics courses. There's no harm done to me. What I care about is the magnitude and the seriousness of the harm and the probability that it will occur. So when we're working on big platforms and in artificial intelligence and stuff like that, I want to know, if there are risks of harm, are they serious? Are they going to pose a real, actual serious risk to people if something should happen or go sideways? And how do we lower the probability that that will happen? So that's why it's essential to work in multidisciplinary teams in these areas, because I work very, very closely with security people that make sure that we bring that probability of risk of harm down as much as we can by using very, very secure systems that are well thought out. It's not just me building something in my bathtub. And then all about harms and balancing risks and benefits. It's also important to think about benefits, though. We don't think enough about benefits. We don't talk about benefits. I recently got revised one of my consent templates with a bunch of patients, and they said, how come you don't talk about why people want to do this and the benefit? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. All we talk about is risks. It's a great point. And there's so many different ways to think about benefit. There's direct benefit to participants, very rare. That's what you try to do with personalized medicine, but that's rare, maybe with really, really late phase clinical trials. There's potential benefits, there's collateral benefits. So maybe you're a breast cancer survivor and you get invited to a focus group, and there's a benefit that you experience from being, with other people that have been through something that you've been through. There's charitable participation standard, which is being able to appreciate the rewards of altruism. There's lots of ways to think about benefit. The important thing with benefit, though, is that the people like you have to benefit in the future. So a great example of that is if you're developing a vaccine, for example, and you're recruiting in a country that could never, ever, ever afford that vaccine, that's not ethical. You have to maybe you're not going to benefit directly, but the people like you in the future will benefit directly. And if you don't participate in research, you can't benefit from it, right? And then there's so many different notions of justice to think about. I know you guys know all this, but one thing that gets missed when we talk about justice is the just distribution of resources and services. So when you spend extra time reviewing something or on compliance that doesn't actually add value, that's an ethics issue, because we only have so many resources in our system, and REBs are never, ever resourced properly. So anything that's spent on bureaucratic nonsense that doesn't add value to your work is an ethics issue. So here's the case study that I want you guys to talk about. I'll read it to you, and then you're going to go away for about 10 minutes and come back and we'll talk about it. And I'll just read it to you first, but when you get back, I'm going to go through a big literature review that a bunch of us did about artificial intelligence, ethics and privacy issues. And we'll go through that a lot, but I want you to kind of get your ethics juices flowing first. So this is an actual case study. So it's one of the teams I'm working with right now. So researchers are creating a national data sharing platform for cancer research. AI technology is going to be used. It's fundamental to it. There is concern about how to share unconsented data from various provinces. The team decides to only use consented data in this initiative. In the consent form, the participant is given the option of which cancers their data can be used for and where their data can be used. So what are some of the ethics issues that come up there? Thinking about autonomy, relational notions of autonomy, thinking about beneficence doing good, not maleficence, not doing harm, justice issues, just distribution of resources and services, all those things, substantive ethics, procedural ethics. Think about those things and just try to brainstorm all the different ethics issues that might come up, and then we'll come back and we'll chat about it. And maybe nominate somebody from your group to just give a list of some of the big ethics issues. That would be a good thing to do. So, the recording came back. Okay, so I thought we could go around quickly and just for each group to say what some of the big ethics issues that came up. Did group number 1 nominate anybody to do that?
Holly, who's in group number 1? I didn't pay attention to what our number was.
Oh, sorry.
It's Doug, Joanne, Catherine, Katrina, Penny, and Susan.
Oh, okay. Well, we're group number 1. There was absolute crickets when I asked if anyone wanted to be our recorder or our person reporting. So I'm gonna take the lead, even though I'm not a research person at all. So some of the things we discussed are. The question was, are participants able to really provide informed consent? Because this is quite complicated, or could potentially be a complicated project with lots of, sort of the use of AI is different for most people. So would the average person who wants to participate really understand kind of what's going on? So that was one thing. So we're thinking that from a risk point of view. You did mention there were multiple, the fourth bullet, multiple options, which we remembered was an operational nightmare. And so there were two things there, risk of increased bureaucracy and also a justice component, because it's kind of wasting, valuable resources on this project to try and manage these consents that could potentially be used for another project. And then we talked a little bit about risk to participants themselves. You didn't specify whether like samples, like blood work or any, genetic material was going to be collected for this purpose. But, are there any health risks to the participants if it's more than just personal information? And then the last quick thing was AI in particular, depending on, well, there could be many, many, many thousands of people participating. AI is very powerful, depending on the amount of personal information and other information being collected. Can we be sure that unintended consequences of data, not matching necessarily, but learning about the participants that maybe you didn't expect them to learn, like just based on the amount of personal information collected and AI's capabilities. So I think those were the four things that we quickly came up with.
That's great. That's awesome. And what about room 2? Paul, that's the one with Paulo's in there. And did you have a nominated person to speak?
Was it Frida or Serenia, if I'm not mistaken?
Hi, it's Frida here. I just took some notes so I could remember what the group was saying, and I think we took a slightly different approach than group 1, because we're kind of thinking of if the participants can pick and choose the data that can be used on them, would the results be skewed as it would be selective information? And another group member did mention that, if this is going to be a national data that would be collected, it would be incomplete and not as broad. Yes. Another member did mention that if you're going to allow participants to pick and choose their data, it should be very clear and detailed what the data would be used for and in what manner, and just make sure that the participants are fully aware of what they will decide on before they want to share their data. I think those are kind of like the key points that we came up with on this. And yeah.
Great, that's great. What about room 3 that has Albert and Gordon and Pia in it? Do you have anything to add to this?
We were pretty, we had similar conversations around group 2, and we were questioning how large is the group, and given that it's national, the more data that is available would make it less risky to identify the potential individual. And we would pose the question in terms of considering only including consented data, because the results again could be not accurate for the larger population. Like basically all the data should be reviewed to help the larger population. Yeah. So Gordon or Serena or Ruby, please add. I just jotted some notes down.
Those are great. Those are great. And what about room 4? Ryan and Sean were in that group?
Yeah, we had kind of 2 main points that we discussed, and the first thought was that the more information collected from each participant, and maybe the more powerful those data are in their potential and future applications, the more difficult it might be for participants to weigh the risks and benefits of their consent. And we wondered, to what extent should the burden be placed on the participants to anticipate all possible applications of their data, especially commercial applications?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about these kinds of big initiatives, and I'm going to give you a couple that we're actually working on right now. There's all the issues you talked about, all great. I mean, yes, all those things we have to be mindful of. The other thing is creating honeypots of data opens you up to attacks in a way that when the data are kept separate, it doesn't. So there's a movement to really have these data federated so they don't actually move together. They're federated, they're kept separate, but there's ways to do analysis on them using artificial intelligence to kind of go to each pot of data. The idea about, voting for what you want your research to be, or how you want your data to be used. Do we really want priorities to be set by voting? I don't think so. Like, here's what will happen. I know just from working for a long time with the BC Cancer people, you will have tons and tons of research in breast cancer and prostate cancer, and you will have no research on bench science and anal cancers and other things that might be stigmatizing. We don't want to vote. We don't want to be voting on how we set research priorities, and we don't want to be leaving people out. And Pia talked about this. When we only use consented data, we know that consent doesn't work for a lot of people. We know, and I'll show you a slide in a little bit, that most people in genetics and genomic studies are white. Most clinical trial participants are white. What about everybody else? Because the way we do consent works really great for some people, and it excludes a whole swaths of other people. And if you don't participate in research, you cannot benefit from research. So then it becomes a benefit issue, but also a justice issue. I just want to move on though to artificial intelligence, some of the specific stuff around there, because artificial itself poses a lot of other interesting challenges. The first thing to think about though, when it comes to artificial intelligence, is kind of be willing to think differently, be willing to come to the table and think about your work completely differently as people who do research, people who work in ethics. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, and I worked with a bunch of my colleagues around the health authorities to do a literature review around this, and then to produce a really short guidance for researchers, which we're working on right now. And Sarah is involved in that, right, Sarah?
That's right.
That's right. Okay. So when we talk about artificial intelligence in our guidance, we're describing it as machine-performed tasks to produce data-driven decision support for clinical care, research, and corporate organization services such as auditing. Some AI uses algorithms to identify patterns in data, and that is the primary focus of the guidance that we produced. I'm going to show you some of the big themes that emerged. One of the big overarching take-home messages here is that the AI has a tendency right now to kind of sneak into universities, sneak into health authorities on kind of a project by project level, and that's actually pretty dangerous. It needs to be looked at by administrative and clinical leaders in a bird's eye kind of way to see kind of the systematic risks, because when we, Ryan talked about this, we really do need to move away from this laundry list of, these are all the things I'm going to consent to a consent to good governance model. Like, who has the moral responsibility here? Do we download all of that moral responsibility onto individuals to every possible use of their data? No. When we're doing these big initiatives with artificial intelligence, we have responsibility to make sure things are done safely and securely in ways that benefit all people. And so to do that and to look at the systemic benefits, but also the systemic risks of harm, like producing findings that are racist or sexist or something like that, or AI can find patterns that are meaningless. So you need to have a lot of involvement from your clinicians to make sure that what is producing is actually meaningful. We need involvement from the data science to make sure that the data that it's trained on is appropriate. There needs to be this systemic bird's eye view on how these things are being operationalized within the health authorities and beyond. So I want to just talk about two projects so you can kind of contextualize this. This isn't like fantasy, as you know, this is really happening. There is an initiative, it's the Pan-Canadian Library, and remember I said that we're doing all this work collecting whole genome sequencing from participants to be used in research and everything. We disagree about what should show up in a consent form, and it ends up not being used. So the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Genetics has become aware of this because it's extremely expensive to be doing all this whole genome sequencing and then just not doing anything with it and not sharing it internationally as it was intended by participants. It's a broken promise to participants. So they're creating a Canadian library of whole genome sequence with the idea that you will share with the library and it'll share with researchers and others around the world. This is really happening. I'm on a group that created the elements that need to be in a consent template to distribute to research ethics boards for their review and to make sure that we have agreement about what needs to be said in order to participate in this national initiative. There's way more words here than is normal for a slide, but just because I want to share these with you after in case you're interested. Here's the other one is the Marathon of Hope Virtual Cancer Center. This is the Terry Fox Research Institute. Lots and lots and lots of millions of dollars going into this one. And it's again to have a virtual cancer system so that what the researchers tell me is that for these stubborn cancers, for these cancers that keep coming back, that we can't seem to, so many cancers can be cured and managed now as chronic illness. Some can't. To get those ones, they need to be able to have access to everybody that has these cancers in Canada. So essentially what would happen is if you get one of these cancers, instead of just working with your research team or your clinical team, because they're really one and the same, to try to come up with some treatment or whatever, it'll ring the entire system and they'll be able to benefit from all the knowledge that is from across Canada, all the data, instead of just the few people that they have seen. And one of the prominent genetics researchers that I work with says that this is, in his view, one of the most important things to happen in genetics in Canada ever. So it's a big initiative, and again, artificial intelligence is central to it because there is no way a human can make their way through all of these vast amounts of data. So you put together these huge pots of data, and then you need artificial intelligence to help make sense of it, and also to see patterns that we're all humans that we don't see. Even these really smarty pants physicians and researchers bring their own bias to the situation. So when we work with artificial intelligence companies, they say, I was at a meeting where the clinician, very prominent clinician, said, well, you'll want us involved to say what that algorithm should do. And he said, no, we want the algorithm to see patterns that maybe you wouldn't see. This is a tool to help you. So it's interesting. So here are some of the themes that emerged from the literature review. So we're well beyond thinking about de-identification and privacy impact assessments and the FIPA, and like that's in the rearview mirror, we're way past that. What we're thinking about is things like data quality, data assessment. So this is this issue of the quality assessment, that this garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. It's a major theme that kept coming up when we reviewed the literature in this area. We need to make sure that the data are trained properly so that we're not just giving this algorithm a bunch of white people data to make assumptions from and leaving everybody out, or that it's not biased and skewed in some kind of way. So we desperately need lots and lots of really smart data people to help with this. Access is another issue, being able to access all of this information at the right time. So these new platforms that are being developed with engineers are going to make sure that it's not enough to just get the data in there and get it analyzed, but researchers need to get access to it at the right moment in order to serve patients and members of the public. We need to make sure that the access is equitable. We have a problem here in BC and other places in Canada where lots of really powerful, prominent researchers can get what they want, and other people that are doing extremely important work, but it might be unfunded, might be PI driven, driven by the investigator work, that not funded, doesn't mean it's not scientifically important, doesn't mean it's not ethical, but they cannot access some of these platforms and things because it costs money. So we need to make sure that if research is scientifically valid and it's ethical, that they have an opportunity, just like anybody, to use these data to serve the public. And then education. We're doing a lot of really interesting data work under our fantastic, the person who heads up our data, Lexi Flatt, and it's a totally new environment. It's a totally different way of doing things. So it's not a matter of just saying to people, okay, now you can have equitable access. That's not enough. They have to be trained to be able to use these new analytic tools that are different than what they've used before. There's new scientific considerations, all sorts of things. Oh, yes, there's a hand up. Paulo. Paulo, did you mean to put your hand up?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Just try to kind of put it down. There you go. Just go. Can you go back one the previous slide?
Yes. Oh.
I just have one question here with respect to training of the algorithm, in which you basically talk about homogeneous data and set certain outcomes. But isn't the data in a certain way a snapshot of a certain point in time? And being a snapshot of a point in time, this is you never. It's always, well, it's not always homogeneous, but it will never actually represent the past. It may not represent the future. See what I mean?
Yes,
I'm looking at Canada as a nation of immigrants that we are, right? And so you change the composition of that, of who is providing the data. So I just kind of wondered if this is something that someone has addressed or thought about.
Well, I mean, look, one of the problems that we have in Canada, and really it's really bad in BC, is that there are some groups, health authorities, organizations, whatever, that are very, very difficult to share data with, to collaborate with, but they might represent some very unique populations. So you can imagine a health authority would have certain health authorities would have very different compositions of people than other health authorities. If they do not participate in research, those people that might be different from people in other areas or geographic areas or whatever cannot benefit from the research. They can't be, if they're not part of it, you can't benefit from it. And that is what's happening. I'll show you some slides at the end of my talk about the fact that in genetics and genomic studies, like I think it's over 96% of people are white. Like it is a homogeneous pot of data for genetics and genomic studies. And so there are efforts to have, like there's the Silent Genome Project, which is trying to bring people from Indigenous backgrounds into genetics and genomics research studies so they can also benefit from it according to their own preferences. And Serene, did you have a question?
I just want to add something. I just want to say that there's something called reinforced learning in machine learning, which may answer the previous question about if things change compared to the past, what happens to the model? Usually in AI, we can reinforce the learning or the model by inputting new data as they come available or as they become available. So that should not be an issue as long as we have access, as you just said, to the data, to those particular or specific set of data that are representative of a very specific part of the community. So the time is not an issue as much as accessing the data.
Interesting. Well, that's why you need to be part of all this going forward. I mean, this is like this multidisciplinary kind of conversation that we're having right now. This is why we cannot have, people like me sitting at our desk trying to come up with, artificial intelligence things or whatever. Like when we work together on the Marathon of Hope and at the whole genome, the genomic whole genome sequence library thing that I told you about, the people around those tables are it's multidisciplinary as it gets. Engineers, lawyers, ethicists, patients are involved right from the start as well, and clinicians, because we all know just our own little piece of the pie. Like I can bring some ethics and privacy knowledge to it, but I can't speak to like the stuff that you were talking about just now, for example. So I'll just keep going because I want you to just talk about, get familiar with all of these themes. Perceptions and norms is another theme that emerges. Are we being transparent about our use of AI? Are we violating any kind of public norms around, and I know that some people worry about, we're going to take decision-making authority away from human experts and put it onto AI. And from what I hear from technical people, that's not very accurate. It's just a tool that serves the clinician and the scientist just like any other tool would, and they're integral to making sure that the patterns that emerge are actually meaningful patterns and they're integral to all the aspects of it. So, but maybe that's something that we would want to talk about with patients and publics. There's been historical discomfort in the research ethics board community and in the privacy community with hypothesis-driven research. We like to, this is not true if you sit in an REB that does a lot of qualitative research, because we do hypothesis-driven stuff all the time in qualitative research. I do too in my own research. But in the scientific world, they don't. They have their research questions and it's different. And so machine learning in these big environments is looking for patterns. It's hypothesis driven. It's what the REBs, some REBs might consider a fishing expedition. So we need to kind of adjust the way we think about science when we're reviewing these kinds of protocols. Patient safety, you know, is it tested or reliable? Of course, that's something that would have to be tested and ensured to make, if this were to ever come into the clinic. And there are times where it's in the clinic. Financial considerations. This is a big one that I don't see people talking a lot about. A lot of these AI companies and other innovative people doing innovative things and making, you know, offering things to the research community, or sometimes they're startups, and that's great. It's great to partner with startups and whatnot. But there is a lot of financial risk involved with, you know, partnering up with these startups. You know, what happens to the data if things don't work out or whatever, as opposed to working with big organizations, international organizations. That has a whole other set of risks and harms potentially associated with it. But we need to think about financial considerations and the relationships that we're building. And then governance is this huge theme that comes up. You know, how does it impact our notion of governance? There's legal considerations, the unethical outputs. It goes on and on. Who's accountable at the end of the day? One of the big things I'm worried about under this theme is, what are we going to do when we have amassed these huge volumes of data that maybe we do not have the resources to make sense of and interpret, and we're not delivering results maybe that we could have to patients and participants in research studies? Is there do we have liability there? Or there's certainly moral considerations to think about there. You know, if we're going to do these big studies and use artificial intelligence and produce millions and millions of data points, we need also to be training and hiring lots and lots and lots of really smart data people and engineers and stuff to help us make sense of these things. Because I don't see us looking forward quite enough. We're all getting really excited about grabbing all these data together and doing all these cool things. But when the data are produced, who is going to interpret it? You know, what data scientists tell me is that ethics boards review and approve these studies, and they should, because they're scientifically valid and ethical. And then they come to the data stewards and say, okay, I'd like my data now, please. And we got one recently at the PHSA where the data steward called me in a panic, and he said, look, this is going to take one of my people 40 hours to pull this part of the data from the health authority. You know, that person is supposed to be serving the whole hospital, and it's going to take 40 weeks just to pull those data. It's like, oh, that's a problem, because we're producing all of these great research opportunities, but we don't have the resources on the other end to serve them properly. So it's a looming issue, in my opinion. So how do we decide, you know, in decisions, you know, in a complex domain like healthcare and health research, how do we know if it's reasonable and just? Well, of course, one way is to work as part of multidisciplinary teams. Another way is to engage publics, patients, members of the public, and others, to make sure that what we're doing is appropriate and not violating any kinds of norms. And that's part and parcel to this consent to good governance approach, as opposed to downloading it all to a consent form, getting someone to sign off, say, there, I've done my work, and somehow piles and piles of consent forms, if we put them all together, that will equal good governance. And it doesn't. Good governance is something different. Some biobanks are really good at this, and they will often have advisory committees of patients and others that help, you know, shape how they're using data and how they govern data and biospecimens. So we need to start doing more in this area. Of course, we know there's so many different ways to engage publics. I don't need to tell you guys about this. We're really trying to determine, you know, what is socially acceptable, what can we all live with, how can we best live together. And those are just some of the projects that I've worked on with some other people around this topic. What's really important is that when we recruit for members of the public to help shape these efforts, that we make sure that we're recruiting for representation of interest. So there's lots of diversity there. Some of the categories that are really hard to recruit for: education, age, and language. It's very easy to recruit people of a certain age, high education levels. Recruiting for diversity of language is complex. We've done some deliberative democracy events in the States, for example, in California, where it's essential that if you're going to do an event and be inclusive, that you have to have Spanish and English events. So we use these, like at the UN, where it's real-time translation, and everyone just has to be encouraged to slow down their talking a little bit so you can translate it at the same time, and then everybody can participate equally. It doesn't matter that there's some Spanish-only speakers or English-only speakers. It doesn't matter. We can all communicate. That's just one example, and then we've done some stuff in Quebec as well. I won't go into that. This is kind of the last topic I want to talk about. It's this idea that inaction is value neutral. And I think that this is, I run across this a lot when we're working in areas like artificial intelligence and doing things that have never been done before. There's this idea that if we do nothing, nothing bad will happen. We'll be okay. If I do nothing, then we're not going to get sued, or I'm not going to get fired, or nothing bad will happen to participants. When we know that's not true in ethics, right? Inaction is not value neutral. If we act, there's consequences. If we don't act, there's consequences. We can do this, do that. The other thing, there's moral consequences to everything that we do. But I think that there is this feeling that of being frozen right now. And I know in my world, trying to deal, if you're working in the health authority, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with the vaccine rollout, because we're all serving multiple aims right now, and there's so much change so quickly, and we've gone to virtual health so quickly, that I think people are feeling even more frozen than normal. There's just been too much change. And so there's a tendency to just say no to things, and that somehow that'll resolve the issue. I'll just say no, that's easier. But there's consequences to saying no. Here's some of the consequences. These are facts. These are old facts, so they still hold true. We know that in British Columbia, we leave out entire health authorities all the time for research studies because we just can't find a way to work with them. In Canada, this happens too. And in fact, Manitoba was told that, at one time, if you wanted to go into Manitoba, I think you had to get like 18 different reviews or something like this. And it's a small population. And the sponsors said to the health minister, like, we're not coming here anymore. It is not worth our time to come here. You are too small. It is too hard to get anything set up. And so they centralized everything there in Research Manitoba so that you have one REB, privacy and institutional review to make that. And they're also changing the privacy law to reflect that change, to centralize. And certainly sponsors are not afraid to say that about coming to Canada, that it is too hard to do research here. It is too hard to set things up. And for a lot of our international clinical trials, there's competitive recruitment. So that means if you're slow setting things up, by the time you finally set it up and eaten up all these resources trying to set up a clinical trial, you've missed your chance to recruit because the other sites have already done it. So sponsors are very open about the fact that it's hard to set things up here. So our funders within Canada, it's something that people like at CIHR and Terry Fox Research Institute are concerned about. So people are left out, BC is left out, Canada's left out. And that's a problem because then our people are left as therapeutic orphans, right? Because if you don't benefit in research, you can't participate in research. It's the fact that 77% of drug applications and biologic license applications in the States the participants are white. And as I said, in genetics and genomics studies, it's like 95 or 96% of the people are white. So we know who's benefiting from that research. So we know that these things are true, that for whatever reason, or the way we're doing consenting, the way that we're doing recruiting, we make it very, very hard for people to participate in research. It needs to be so easy. Your doctor needs to be able to reach out to you. Researchers need to be able to contact you and text you and tell you about great research opportunities. Make it easy for people to come in. We need to consult with groups that are underserved by research and ask them, how can we serve you better? How can we do research with you and do research that's important to you? All these things need to happen because we are producing therapeutic orphans. And that's a term, if you're not familiar, that comes from the pediatrics literature, when there was at one time they did all sorts of unethical things to children and institutionalized people and stuff in research. And then there was a swing to not include them because we don't want to harm them. But by swinging it the other way, by not including children in research, then you have all these drugs and stuff that are going into children's bodies, and they have no idea how it's actually going to affect them. It's very dangerous. And so they're called therapeutic orphans. Women were left out of research for a long time, although the gender balance seems to be figuring itself out a little bit better now. So that's good. But working with my researchers who work with Indigenous populations, I mean, they are left out of research all the time. And one of the researchers I work with calls them the asterisk nation, because there's so few people, Indigenous people in the research study, that they're kind of rolled up and put in a footnote at the bottom, you know, so that's a real tragedy. So all of these challenges ahead require, in my opinion, a multidisciplinary approach. We talked about that many times. How are we going to follow the OCAP principles, working with First Nations for ownership, control, access, and possession? You know, they are data sovereign. How are we going to respect that? How are we going to encourage different models of consent that can make it so much easier for people to participate in research, and also lower the administrative and bureaucratic burden for collecting consent for researchers and others? Pia and I are on a project with a bunch of ethics people and patients trying to figure out when you could use pragmatic consent, when it would be appropriate. And pragmatic consent is really an alteration of consent where maybe you go into the clinic. I have one physician right now who I work with. Her name is Zadira. She works with renal patients, and they get lots of blood taken from them. And she might say to them, hey, you know, I want to take an extra vial of blood for research purposes. Is that okay? And they could talk about it, and then she could mark it in their chart, as opposed to going through some big consent process, because these are people that are very, very sophisticated with the healthcare system. They're used to research. That might be a case where it would be okay, for example. I don't know. We'll see what the research proves out. We're in the middle of doing our expert interviews and stuff like that, but we need to kind of, you know, get with it with consent and do things differently. How are we going to manage unspecified future use in genetics topics like whole genome sequencing and special populations? Think about that library that's being created. It creates all sorts of huge national risks. What if you do find something in there that is material to somebody's health? How can we go back to all of these people? Do we have the resources to do that? Or is that something that we're not going to do? I could go on and on and on. There's so many issues at that national level. How do we ensure meaningful continued public engagement to support good governance of data sharing? How can we make sure that we continually are checking in with the public to make sure what we're doing is appropriate? And how do we modernize our compliance mechanisms within institutions to keep up with the preferences of publics? And so in our last just a couple minutes that we have, I wanted to revisit as a group the Pan-Canadian Genomic Consent Initiative, the Canadian Library of Whole Genome Sequencing. So thinking about everything that we've talked about here and what is permissible, I hope you can see that when you look at section 35, it's like, it doesn't give you any guidance. You can do all of these things. Tri-Council policy statement has more nuance in it, but of course it doesn't speak specifically to, you know, artificial intelligence and everything. Given all of these issues that we've talked about and the creation of therapeutic orphans and, you know, material incidental findings, what big ethics issues emerge from your perspective with this Canadian Library of Whole Genome Sequencing? What would you be worried about? What would you be hopeful about? And I'll just open it up to everybody for the last few minutes.
I'd just like to say I worry about the commercialization. I would like to donate things so that they benefit everyone and not just Pfizer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, when you look at the bioethics literature in this area, that is absolutely one of the things that comes out so strongly, that people, the whole issue around commercialization and who's benefiting and stuff like that is something that has to be carefully thought out. And that's also a reason to involve lawyers and IP, you know, intellectual property people, like right from the start, to make sure that it doesn't go. Here's what happens. Sometimes researchers are so happy to have anyone help them, because it's very, very hard to do research, that they'll kind of give away the kitchen sink. They just are so happy to have some company, you know, come and help them. But we have to slow down, and we need to really think about how things are going to unfold in the future, and think about this issue of commercialization. I think it's really important. Doug? Is Doug going to say something?
I wasn't, but I will.
Okay.
I mean, I'm very interested. I mean, I've had my genome sequenced by 2 different companies, and it is a commercial venture. The things that people worry about is, well, who's going to, find out stuff about? You end up finding out things that you don't intend to find out, like who your granddaddy was, or and things also, like now DNA is used for crime all over the place. And so, are people going to not participate because they're going to worry that something's going to come out of that? So there's all that stuff. And the fact is, I mean, they promote these things because they say, yeah, we're going to tell you what your likelihood of developing this, that, and the other thing. And I can, I can show you my whole list of things if I wasn't worried about disclosure. So that's one thing. But also around this whole discussion that we've been having, this a bit off topic, is around the idea that allopathic medicine is about research based, but as we know, there's all kinds of people running around using herbal medicines and traditional medicines and alternative medicines and homeopathy and naturopathy, and also, like, who's to say that an outcome it couldn't be related to the fact that someone's also taking X, Y, or Z that they've bought down at the local store, and that's had so I'm just throwing these things out there for no particular reason other than because it's just fun. Sorry.
You know what? Can I tell you, I had a conversation about this exact issue yesterday with a couple of people about the need to link to administrative data, and that's like hospital visits and all this kind of stuff. Because of what you're just saying, people take different supplements, they have different things happen to them. They might be there might be environmental, like the environment may have done things to them, or the other thing they like to link to is education and all these kinds of things to see, because they have impacts on your health. And that's exactly why researchers kind of want to get the whole story about you. So yeah, you're bringing up a really important point, but then that also raises all sorts of risks. The more information you collect about people and put it in a big honeypot makes it, people like to hack into it. Sean, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, yeah, I just wanted to actually sort of going off of, because Doug had brought up something that had entered my own mind as well about the potential legal ramifications of sharing your genomic data in terms of not only you, but your relatives, for example, being implicated or caught in a crime, for example, because of the existence of your DNA in a database. I think that's something that's really worrying, actually. And I wonder, if there's anything that any ideas around how to deal with that potential problem.
I think I actually have a case study about that. There's a murder and rape case of Molly Dodd, and that's one of the cases where they use the DNA to free somebody, but also implicate somebody else. But anyway, yes, it's something that I think a lot of people are thinking about, and yeah. Rana, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to make another or ask you another question, but
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I thought it was really interesting. In fact, I teach a course in AI and ethics, and it never really occurred to me the point you made about how this huge collection of data could actually create bias in who's able to do the research.
Yeah.
Take Langara, right? We're a small institution. Most of our researchers, even if they get funding from the government, they're for small scale projects. And if that precludes them from getting access to this data that, people with large amounts of funding are able to access, that really, again, creates this disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And that is necessarily going to add to more bias in who's being, who's actually analyzing the data and who's making interpretations and who's involved. And
I totally agree. It's a huge concern. I mean, like, how are these huge things going to be funded? Like, do you have to pay and maybe it's right. Yeah, if you have a lot of money, you should pay. But what about if you're an investigator-led study that is unfunded? Like maybe you should be able to get access without getting paid. But those things have to be thought about it, right? And Paula?
It's just going back to the genomic here, the Canadian Genomic Consent Initiative, the Canadian Library, just a hypothetical. And if, for example, at one point in time, someone that administers this sort of information uses that information to impede your movement, either within the country or to other places, is that something that we should consider?
I think when you put together these huge amounts of data, you should consider all of those things, because there's so many future uses of these data that we cannot conceive of right now. And we can't just think about all of the great things that could happen, because a lot of great things could happen, but a lot of negative things could happen. You could constrain people in all sorts of strange ways that we aren't anticipating right now. Like we never thought we'd be in a pandemic, and here we are and talking about like vaccine passports and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that. What? Yeah. So I think that you want to make sure that whoever is governing these data is a multidisciplinary group thinking about all of these kinds of things, and that these things are really heavily reviewed and governed to make sure that there aren't nefarious uses, because it's incredibly powerful to bring all of these data about people together, especially your whole genome sequence. Like there's nothing more precious about you than that. And you can't change it. Yeah. Oh gosh, we're at the end of time, Rana.
I was just going to say, are there any other questions or comments for Holly while we have her?
No, thank you very much. It was very interesting.
My pleasure.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Holly. So let's leave it here. And like I said, we've recorded this, and Holly has agreed to share her slides if you want to access some of those, especially the information that she's provided. But thank you very much, Holly. That was really informative. I have 3 two-sided pages of notes that I'm going to go back and review. And thanks everyone for coming. Have a good rest of the day.